Good afternoon, and welcome to the final webinar in the ALCTS Institutional Repository Series for the spring of 2010. I'm Cindy Hepfer. My colleague Pamela Blue and I are delighted that you've joined us for the webinar on IR assessment. We wish to thank Berkeley Electronic Press for sponsoring the Institutional Repository Series. Our presenters are Allison Civek and Leah Vanderyacht from the University of Alberta Libraries. Allison has worked at the UA Libraries as the assessment librarian since 2007. Prior to that, she worked for 4 years as a research associate on the first national study of human resources in Canadian libraries. Leah is the Digital Repository Services Librarian. She administers their repository, which is called ERA, Education and Research Archive, oversees library operations for electronic theses and dissertation submission, and manages and directs the delivery of libraries' open access journal systems service. Allison and Leah will take questions at the end of their presentations, but please feel free to submit your questions via the question box at any time during the webinar. I will now turn the microphone and screen over to Allison and Leah.
And this is Leah. Hello, and I will proceed with our presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you also for the invitation to present today for this opportunity. I'd like to just say a little bit about who we are just in relation to and what we're doing in relation to our institutional repository right now, sort of where we're at, which might provide a bit of context for the way that we approach this whole idea of assessment. We launched our institutional repository after a couple of years of development in January of this year, and so that's a project that I lead and oversee all operations for. And Allison, I work with. Allison, would you like to just explain your role just in relation to the repository?
Sure. I'm the assessment librarian here at University of Alberta Libraries. My role in the institution is to provide certainly some kind of one-to-one hands-on help with people in their assessment projects, but it's also to help the institution as a whole try to understand kind of big priorities for assessment, where assessment resources and decision-making capacity needs to be built through assessment, that kind of thing. So my job is very sort of about helping to strategize and directional kind of focus. And so Leah and I are actually just starting to work together on kind of the whole process of assessment with ERA and how that's going to work and what it will mean to us in the future.
Thanks. So just today, as per our abstract, we're going to talk about the field of assessment and how that pertains to IRs. We're going to talk primarily about understanding assessment itself as it applies to IRs, given our investigation. We started out by thinking that we would report on various aspects of IRs and what conclusions can be drawn, but what we found was that there was enough literature about assessment itself that we found themes that emerged, and we'd like to present those today. So we'll mention some specific assessment investigations, and we know that these investigations come out you know, almost on a weekly basis, and so this is about a bigger picture. We will propose at the end of our presentation kind of a larger agenda for assessment, and we hope to have some discussion of that in response to what we found. So we would ask, just for the seminar, just if we could hold questions at the end. We'll address what we can as time permits, and if we run out of time, we will be able to follow up with those by email as long as you submit them using the software for this webinar. So with that, I'll move forward. And so just in terms of where we start from, let's just go right back to a foundational document most of us are familiar with who work in institutional repositories, which is Rain Crow's really visionary document outlining what it was that we hoped and dreamed to achieve with institutional repositories as a global movement, really. It's expressed as a global system. The matters of centralizing, preserving, and accessibility, transforming scholarly publishing. And I think that it's true, and we know that in many ways and in certain facets of the way that we deliver our programs, we're not really there yet. And we ask why, and one of the ways that we ask why, as opposed to sitting around and kind of bemoaning why isn't this working, we ask why in structured ways, and we do this via assessment, both formal and informal. So just to talk a bit about how we approach the work for today's webinar, we thought it would be valuable, again, to just conduct review of articles about assessment about institutional repositories. So what we did was we reviewed 30 articles published on that subject since 2003, so kind of right after, or at least about a year after, that initial visionary statement on the previous slide. So when this was all really hitting the ground originally. As we share these recurring themes and we offer the structure for thinking about IR assessment, this is what we hope to offer to you, but we need to express the limitation that, this is not a systematic review per se on this matter, but we do believe it is a deeply representative overview. And we hope that by focusing on themes, that the ideas we present here will not quickly become outdated statistics necessarily, and that this contribution to the series may continue to have relevance in the future. That is our hope for this, but it is also a limitation. Is it a bit easier to hear me? I've had some feedback that it's hard to hear Leah. Okay, I'm just going to continue. Now, given this original formative vision, there's a few statements. Let's look at some reflections on assessment that speak in different ways to what we're calling that original formative vision, that dreams and hopes and promises, keeping in mind that first slide. So these three quotes show three major ideas that it seems sort of behoove us to revisit our ideals and our past. You could interpret them as somewhat discouraging or confounding statements, are somewhat confusing. Really, they're critiques or observations, and I think that's probably the most useful way to interpret these sorts of responses to that formative vision. So our early visions and assumptions form our current practices, but it seems overall, and this is why we've just got these three overview statements, it seems overall that our current practices, for the most part, are not relating deeply to that original visionary call. So how does this all relate to assessment? So in order to answer that question, I'm actually going to hand the presentation at this point over to Allison, who's going to speak to us about assessment in general and how it's appropriately applied to library services in general and specifically to IRs.
Okay, thank you very much, Leah. And so one of the things that we're doing here is we're also trying to unpack a few statements just to make sure that we are really speaking a common language. And so I'm going to unpack the concept of why assessment to start with. Why do we actually conduct assessment? Essentially what it is, assessment is it's a tool for decision making. It helps us focus on the user. It reminds us of the gap between our perceptions working in the field and users' perceptions who are not as familiar with certain things like a crisis in scholarly publishing as we are. When assessment helps us to make decisions, it's about resource allocation or justification for certain services or programs to our funders, to our parent institutions, and those could be your chief librarian or your university or college. And it also helps us understand what trends are going on so that we can try to plan for the future in a quickly changing environment. it's important for us to also understand that one very vital form of assessment, of course, is needs assessment. An example that we would present that would be relevant to the IR context is, do we actually need an institutional repository at our institution? If so, what should it do? And so one thing that is actually very interesting is the quote on the last slide that Leah had shown us from Smith, who said, there are no consensus what institutional repositories are for. Something else that we have seen is that Smith had also said that that assessment for IRs was happening after the IR was launched. It wasn't something that institutions had been doing, according to survey data, in order to justify the creation of the IR to start with. So in that case, that's not really a needs assessment. That's an attempt to sort of say what are the factors for success in order for us to sort of realize our big picture goals. So those visionary statements in a lot of ways I think set the stage and set sort of the context for our discourse around what kinds of things we're trying to measure. So it's a bit of an irony that we talk about assessment after the fact, and we do see that in a lot of library services, that we don't necessarily integrate assessment from the beginning. And so that takes us to the question, where are we at really with IR assessment? And what we see there, if we could just move to the next slide, what we see there is that really one of the greatest problems that IRs are facing is their inability to provide what McDonald and Thomas call sufficient statistical and assessment data in order to justify their existence. That's quite a dramatic statement. But what this encapsulates to us is what we have seen in the literature review we did, which is that assessment is all over the place right now. What Leah and I have seen that we think is that people are still exploring in really interesting and creative ways, not always meaningful ways for every IR, but they're investigating methods and measures that we hope will tell us how we are doing. Now, when we think about what is the ubiquitous measure, what is the measure that so many people care about, the one measure to rule them all is how many. As Leah and I have been talking and preparing for this, what we have discussed is, what Leah has sort of expressed to me in her conversations with other IR managers, is the idea that she gets the first question she generally gets from another IR manager is, what software are you using? And then the second one is, how many items do you have in there? This is very normal to the library environment. I mean, we think about collections and we think about size, and very often the kinds of measures that really impact us may be things like collection size or number of volumes in the ARL measures, for example, that actually impact a sort of ranking that help our chief librarians and our parent institutions understand how important, quote unquote, or how big or valuable or meaningful we are. So ARL Investment Index is another example of that. But what we think is important to question, of course, is really how meaningful is that? That provides a very particular kind of shorthand, that measure, that our sort of administrators can understand. What does that actually really mean in terms of whether or not we provide valuable service, whether or not people engage with it and in a sustained way? There are all kinds of questions that are unanswered by a single measure, and yet this is one that seems to be a common sort of anxiety point for a lot of IR managers, is how many things are in your repository. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go over a few different examples of measures that are in the literature. And we have very loosely grouped them into some categories here. So content profile is one of them. That comes back to things like the one measure to rule them all, the volume of articles published. We've seen other things that talk about how much of your IR content represents the proportion of your faculty's total publishing, or how much open access literature is there in a particular discipline. Content usage is another one, and that's getting a bit closer to the idea of usage and engagement. So, not just journal impact, but do individual articles have impact? What kind of internal system measures are there? What are different download rates for preprints versus postprints. That's sort of a finer version, I guess, of individual article impact. Other kinds of usage statistics. An interesting one that we've seen recently talks about the idea that open access doesn't necessarily mean more frequent citation, but it may mean sort of the speeding up of the article citation or impact that has been published open access. So does that actually sort of move knowledge along, or does it move research along? So, you know, these are some examples. We've got some that speak to things like user engagement, for example. So lots of surveys on faculty attitudes towards the institutional repository or to self-archiving. CAR in 2007 put forward a question of, you know, is it about sustained engagement? IRs in many ways are about relationships to your faculty or relationships to students, alumni, other users. So, you know, is that something we should be measuring? Chaudhary put forward something which was about program sustainability. You know, is this something that we are actually going to be able to sort of maintain well into the future? And that does also speak a little bit to questions of preservation. User satisfaction or usability. And a really dramatic example that we saw, and I'm sorry I don't have the citation there, is the business case. So, you know, one really big way that we'll understand if the IR is an essential service for our users is take it away and see if people get upset. And that's not going to happen. But it's one way to sort of think about sort of how dramatic some of these measures could be, or about some of the things that we actually didn't know when we were starting because we didn't do that needs assessment to start with. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a Spanish author, Bonilla Carrero, who published sort of a series of what they called activity indicators. And this is a number of things, a co-authorship index, collaborations across different centers or institutions, the positioning of your faculty member's name in the paper. Are they first author, second author? Time from the deposit to the first access. How quickly are people finding things? Number of distinct countries that cite or download each document. And you know, these measures are actually quite intriguing to me. But again, while Leah and I were talking about this, we were like, well, in some ways, this is sort of a demographic profile still of our content. So it's like descriptive statistics around properties and usage. And so, I think in some ways, it certainly puts together a lot more measure possibilities. It doesn't necessarily answer that question of meaning. Now, I'm just going to focus on one particular area of measurement, which is metadata. And if we were going to focus on a unit of analysis that we think has a huge impact for IRs across platforms, that would be metadata, which allows for interoperability. So, of course, it helps us maybe sort of think more towards meeting those visionary goals at the very beginning about sort of the revolution and the disaggregation of scholarly publishing. But you know what the literature is saying right now is that there actually is a really poor controlled vocabulary and authority control. So you know that whole question of how metadata is working with other institution repositories, you know, is still under debate and still under wrestling. And if we're going to talk about what should the units of analysis be around metadata, Bruce and Hillman in 2004 put forward a series of quality indicators which actually provide us with a bit of a structure that hopefully, that actually maybe speak a little bit to sort of quality of potential access. So those include completeness, accuracy, provenance, conformance to expectations of the user, logical consistency and coherence, timeliness, and accessibility. So that is a structure out there that we could use as sort of a guideline to oversee our metadata schema. But I think again, you know, that question of units of analysis is something we should unpack a little bit more. what is the unit of analysis and what can it tell us? And when we think about what a unit of analysis can do, it is a huge question in terms of our assessment. It determines exactly what we can assess and how, the methods by which we can actually assess it, whether it's strict counting or qualitative work. It really limits what we can conclude from our unit of analysis. And that's, again, something very consistent with library services assessment throughout all kinds of areas. So, very simply put, the count of the number of objects in your IR will not tell us the quality of the metadata, will not tell us about the usability interface, and it will not understand what users could potentially see using the IR for, or where they see gaps in terms of the integration of the IR into some of their workflow. So that big question of how many is important. It's going to be something that the chief librarian or the parent institution always asks you. It is very important to not assume that that equals your quality, and that we work hard together to come up with measures of quality. So what I have detailed up till now has really been sort of a series of individual measures, and some really interesting, exciting recent work talks about, simple measures versus complex systems, because on the one hand, with things like the ARL statistics, we are used to very much sort of counting things, and we see the change in the counting, and those series of measures sort of add up to a demographic profile of the institution in our minds. But IRs are not simply collections of things. They are complex systems that have a lot going on technologically, within the scholarly environment, within the publishing environment, economically, in terms of interpersonal relationships. A lot is going on there. And Chaudhry's 2008 article says something really interesting. Rather than looking at cause and effect relationship as a very sort of simple way of understanding IRs, maybe we should actually think of them in a correlational manner. He also said, if we're going to return to the ideas, those visionary statements about IRs and scholarly communication, IRs have not yet inspired major changes in scholarly publishing. He says maybe they could play a good role in supporting data-intensive scholarship. And he puts forward something which Leah and I have been thinking about quite a bit, which is, he feels that the ways in which libraries have supported and tried to advance IRs seems to have focused on, here's an exclusive role. This particular product is going to preserve your items, or it's going to increase your citation impact, et cetera, rather than the IRs are part of a huge network of scholarly communication and institutional services from the library and faculty support, and how are they going to integrate into this sort of complex environment. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time focusing on a recent article that maybe some of you have read by Kim and Kim in 2009, and it talks about interrelationships between factors and IRs, and they talk about procedural assessment. And what we've got up here now are sort of a series of beginning factors. This article is actually 2008, of groupings that Kim and Kim put together. Now I just want to pause for a moment, and I will talk a little bit about their methods in more detail. But I want to emphasize right here is that part of Kim and Kim's assessment was looking at not only visionary statements of what we suspected in the beginning that IRs could do or might do, but they were also taking into account what IR managers were saying that they were dealing with on the ground when they were working with faculty and hearing faculty interests and concerns and dealing with their IT departments and trying to think about metadata, et cetera, et cetera. So, they're looking at content, management and policy, IR awareness, archiving methods, system and network stuff, use, user, and submitter. And if we look at what they did with that particular series of inputs, we get to sort of their method in which they sort of diagram for us kind of how they went about determining what some of these important factors were. So if we can just shift ahead to the next slide. I'm just going to talk briefly about their approach. I'm not a highly statistical person, so I can't go in depth into some of their exact findings, but I think what they've done here is present us with a really interesting model that might help us conceptualize of, should we replicate this experiment and see what we see in North America. So they used the Delphi method. They started with a big literature review, came up with their conceptual framework of 4 categories and 19 items. And then they worked, did a 3-round Delphi study. They worked with librarians who had run an IR for at least 1 year. So they had very practical, tacit knowledge and experience. And they did focus group interviews as well with chief librarians. So those are the visionary people, the people who have actually been able to secure the funding for these projects and to try and sort of validate and define those indicators. What this procedural assessment allows us to do is sort of study relationships between inputs and outputs, what we're investing or what other users or depositors are investing in the IR, and what some of the outputs are. That helps to understand how that system is working as a whole. It helps us map out that system. What they do there is after the focus group interviews with the chief librarians, they sort of distilled down their categories. They conducted a field study survey, and then they conducted data analysis, fact analysis, correlation, regression analyses, and they have come out with 12 factors that they're calling key performance factors. And our next slide is just going to give you a bit of a sense of the complexity of this. Now, I am not going to explain the stats here, but what I think is really evident about this particular illustration from Kim and Kim is that it shows us, here are these spheres, these key performance factors and key performance spheres around IRs. And what you can see, for example, on the right-hand side with use rate, a lot of different kind of individual factors are kind of impacting on that, and that includes things like registration rate, and it includes allocation of resources and archiving. With the triangular sort of shapes here, what you also see, and one of Kim and Kim's big conclusions is you don't, there are certainly direct relationships between, say, registration rate and use rate. There are also indirect relationships. The registration rate also relates to multi-functionality, which also impacts use rate. So what I think is actually very conceptually useful here is it gives us a sense of, okay, it's not just A equals B plus C. It is the complexity of how those different things interact with one another and how we can sort of try to understand how those things influence each other. And I think that makes a bigger challenge for us in terms of understanding assessment. But I think we're getting closer to something which is more understandable in terms of meaningfulness. So what I'm going to do now is pass the mic over to Leah, and she's going to take us through to some larger thoughts that we had and some suggestions we have for a research agenda.
Thanks, Allison. So the next sort of type of knowledge relating to institutional repositories that we gather that I'd like to discuss right now is what we'll call tacit knowledge. So this is the kind of a form of knowledge that does apply to IR development and deployment. And it's not necessarily formalized systematic knowledge generation as we find in research and assessment projects. But this is the kind of knowledge that you learn at institutional repository conferences at the coffee breaks while you're networking, and sort of from the word on the street, from your trusted, often underground network of colleagues who are carrying out IR work. You send a little note and you say, well, what are you doing about this? And then you ask a few people and you gather that information together and you make your judgment call as the project manager. The information's in your gut, in terms of your ability to carry out decision making around a project. That is a form of knowledge. Practical literature, so sometimes we call this literature, how I done good at my library, and it's, it's a specific report, at our library, this is how institutional repository implementation and deployment unfolded for XYZ thing or overall. So there are many of these sorts of standalone articles, and they're not necessarily the type of articles from my perspective that we necessarily need to exclude from an assessment framework as we move forward. And I think that we should actually be careful not to be dismissive of this form of knowledge, because it is so valuable. I mean, I have found it very valuable. For example, last week I was at a meeting of all institutional repository managers in Canada, and we have these roundtable meetings. We sort of tack them on to technical related conferences that happen in Canada, and everybody comes away with just a whole bunch of great information that to bring home and implement and talk to our colleagues about. And yet it's not formalized, and so where does it really sit? Well, one thing that I think we should say about this is we're really not alone in that kind of use of information. And so what Allison and I have discussed around this is just that this actually is debated, to use one analogy, within education theory. So there's the matter of the standardized tests that students take, and the know-how and assessment of the teacher in terms of where that student is at. So that's kind of what this is about, what that difference is there, and that both forms of knowledge there are valuable. One is deeply formalized and one is deeply informal, but both have a role and they may be complementary. And so I think that it's important, and it is my view that we should not view this as bad knowledge. This is not bad assessment. This is maybe perhaps something we can articulate as a living body of knowledge. It's what we build as we learn and do. So given, and I'll talk a little bit about tacit knowledge later, just as I make one proposal for what we do with all of this. But I'm just going to move forward just to make some statements overall about some of the stuff that we've discussed already, leading towards a challenge, I suppose, that I would put to this community of listeners here today, and in general to the worldwide community that is working on an institutional repository dream. Which is, given all of this, so if we're going to move forward with assessment for our IRs, let's be clear about a couple of things about assessment in general. So 2 things. Assessment is not, to read this, assessment is not clearly objective. Assessment is not value neutral. Well, why is that? Well, there's a couple of really important reasons why that is, and anybody who works in any kind of, I think, sort of program deployment or new service will be familiar with why it is that assessment within an institution is not necessarily an objective or value neutral activity. And so the first reason behind that is really who's asking. I mean, we need to respond in our assessment planning and our evaluation based on the needs of the asker. So it may be if we're looking at how successful is this program, where does it sit within sustainability planning for services that we deliver at the library. It may be that the assessment agenda is set based on things like cost-benefit analysis, and that would probably be a form of assessment that would be externally prescribed or prescribed by administration. So there's that kind of question, and then IR managers themselves kind of know where an IR is at that they're managing and really what they want to know about it. So for me right now, one of the things that I'm really trying to understand is how well have we reached out to a variety of groups on our campus. We have a campus of 40,000 students and about 4,000 faculty, so I'm really interested in the idea of, are we reaching a diverse group? So that's my question. And then there's, of course, the questions of the people who are using the IR. So, we may have have end users who are deeply engaged with the process, and they may have questions as well, perhaps about the interface. They may be telling us, this doesn't really work for me, and then that might drive us to move towards a usability study. So there's always some kind of bias at play, and that's not necessarily wrong or a bad thing. It's just a reality of assessment. And again, there's this whole idea of why we're asking. So there's the who's asking, and sometimes the who is, like if the who's asking is, the president of the university or your provo, you may actually be able to accelerate your assessment program given the demand for an answer. So there's the matter of pacing, of course, but there's also this whole idea of why we're asking. And I think an important thing to acknowledge is the concept of institutional politics. So sometimes in libraries, we're actually asking questions or conducting assessments in order to stake our claim, particularly in terms of IRs as responsible stewards of this information. So actually providing some kind of evidence that we are acting as responsible stewards. So if you think about, and if you're familiar with digital preservation assessment checklists like the track checklist or the Platter initiative that actually allows you to go through your repository and consider matters of trusted digital repository and so on, is really a helpful kind of form of assessment as it pertains specifically to digital preservation. Funding, of course, and resource allocation. This is about questions around what is the value proposal? What is the value that we're putting forth to the academy and to this global system? Measuring that is quite hard. So we might return to, well, here is the valuable service as articulated by those we serve. It may not, again, reflect our original vision, but it's meeting a need that we didn't originally expect. So this whole why we're asking around funding and resource allocation, as I've observed it over the last certainly couple of years, has come up more, and these cost-benefit analysis investigations are very interesting. And of course, rankings. People want to know sort of where are we at in comparison to other institutions. That is natural within an academic environment, and I think it is to be expected. But assessment is meant, as we said, it's meant to help with decision making, and that decision making need. It comes from a person who plays a particular role in the institution with a particular agenda. So assessment in and of itself is not going to provide a clear measure of success. There are just so many questions at hand, and there are so many things to look at that it can be a very confusing environment at times. But just to jump back up to this, given all of this, just to reinforce, we should disabuse ourselves, I think, of this idea that we're operating in an objective and value-neutral environment, because that really is the case, particularly given matters of politics and cost. Just to move forward. This statement, I think, is really interesting, and I think it's important. As we were going through the literature, I saw this some form of this statement over and over, and I didn't just see it in the studies that we looked at, from 2003, 2004, like really even recently, like as recently as this year, the statement. These are early days, and this is not a dismissive statement. It's an observation. I think we should acknowledge that these are early days. Like, it's 2010, and the visionary statement that we originally articulated is from 2002, so we're 8 years in. So I don't really know, what people's sense is of what that means for, like, where we should be at developmentally, but I guess I'm sort of thinking of IRs as being 8 years old. As maybe I'm thinking of it as like an 8-year-old child. Maybe, this, in terms of the matter of early days, this is an important and valid statement, because we need to consider the matter of early days and what it is that we do not know. because we may need to assert that it is too soon to tell for some of the questions that we would like to ask. We may not have enough data. We may need to assert that we need to be comfortable that tacit knowledge is what is moving these projects forward. And it's that form of information assessment that we're really working from right now. And I think that saying, it's a bit too soon to tell is an okay thing to state. And I'm comfortable and becoming more comfortable with saying, I don't know. And I think the more that we say, well, I don't really know and it might be too soon to tell, is something that is not necessarily exclusively something to observe, but maybe at times something we need to assert, and that's my position on that matter. So to recall the Kim and Kim study that Allison describes and the many factors analyzed there, so we're in a complex system. We've observed also that we're in early days. So what do we do? I mean, what do we do with this complex study that we've got at hand that Allison and I are finding very interesting, and the idea that we're in early days? So what do we do with such a situation for service assessment planning? So this model from the Kim and Kim study may provide us with just one method of maybe beginning to map elements of that tacit knowledge as we explain it, as we describe it and exchange it over coffee, and write it down and keep track of it and conduct our own literature research on it. Mapping that to studies like this, so that we can start to maybe consider mapping that tacit knowledge to an assessment framework. And so this is one framework that we could think about. So that's moving sort of from tacit knowledge to a more structural investigation. And I think that we can get there. We just need to understand what our path forward is. And so when we think about that path, well, what does that path mean? And one phrase that I've been using as I've been discussing this at our institution is this idea of what I think would be developmentally appropriate measures, and that is, so from all of these choices that we present, so we talked about a lot of different studies. We talked about one study that we find particularly interesting. All are valid, none are necessarily wrong. I'm asserting that also in terms of tacit knowledge. We're looking at different units of analysis, different measures. Where do we start in terms of what we do? Because the worst thing that we could do is really just sort of throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do anything. It's early days. We have tacit knowledge. There's nothing we can do. We understand this now more, that perhaps there is a path of assessment that matches typical program launch and new service understandings, and that we draw upon proposed agendas, and as a community of practice start to agree on what the stages are in that path. So we could start with tacit knowledge and mapping it to complex systems of understanding, like the Kim and Kim study. Perhaps move to multi-center quantitative or mixed methods investigations, thinking down the road, and really we should anticipate success. Like, let's anticipate that the IR movement will continue to have legs and move forward, and think that in the future it will ultimately be possible, if we set ourselves up well for it, to do the sort of assessment that is quite powerful. So a meta-analysis, perhaps of studies that have been replicated, and in the best of all possible worlds combined. So let's think now back to what the kinds of knowledge are that we're gathering now, and how we can start to, when we're publishing our assessment studies, what it is that we're reporting and sharing to each other, and how it is that we're expressing those methods, so that people can understand them, and if possible, conduct some kind of meta-analysis. So that's speaking actually to the second proposal, Proposal B on this slide. But also just perhaps if we could agree on this idea that we actually have a research agenda that has a path, and that perhaps institutional repositories should be evaluated according to their developmental stage, so that the repository that was launched this January should not necessarily be measured using the same sort of investigation as an IR at another institution where the goals and environment are different, or it's been on the ground for 5 years or so. So this is what we've ultimately arrived at together, and this is what we would propose to the IR community is an idea of starting to try to pull together a research agenda and possibly a continuum or a path of assessment. I'm very interested in this idea, and I think we should, as we think about these developmentally appropriate measures, also think again about this assertion that we're not ready to ask certain questions, and indeed if we ask them at a certain point, we may even undermine our own goal. It may be too early even to ask how many. If we have, say, 1,000 objects or objects within collections sort of lined up at our door, but we're sorting out workflow. Like, that's the wrong time to ask how many, perhaps. So what we're proposing is this idea of developmentally appropriate measures and a continuum that we could, and standards that we could select from and begin to discuss as a broader community and really as a worldwide community. And with that, we're actually going to ask for questions and comments. We're very interested in people's feedback and any comments people would have, or any studies people would like to raise at this time on anything we've presented today.